Welcome everybody. Kia ora koutou. Ki te hui hui. The Data and Information Committee meeting. We've only got a couple of items to go through today, but we'll start with apologies. I don't think we have any apologies. Is Councillor Colvert going to come?
Yes,
she is. Okay, so she's just a few minutes away. Okay.
Yes.
Is that and public forum? We haven't had any requests for that. Confirmation of the agenda.
Can I move that for you?
Moved. Councillor Hope, seconder, please. Seconded. Councillor Noon, thank you very much. Conflict of interest. Members are reminded of the need to stand aside from decision making when a conflict arises between their role as elected representative and any private or external interest they may have. So confirmation of previous minutes, of the minutes of the 8th September meeting.
To move those for you.
Moved Councillor Hope, seconded Councillor Wilson. Thank you very much. All in favour?
Aye.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the actions register. Should we just go through that? Has anybody, have we got anybody to take any questions? Have we got any? Yeah, I don't think we actually, do we have an actions register on this? Okay. Has anybody got any questions on the actions register?
Apologies, the last one says it's coming to this. Oh, that's council. That's all right. That's why. Apologies. Ignore me.
Okay, so anybody got anything to add? Looks like it's all pretty much on track. 3112 for the act of fault. Okay, so we'll move into matters for consideration. Do I have to move anything for the action? No, that's all good. Clutha Delta and Molyneux Bay, coastal morphology and natural hazards. Absolutely fascinating report. If a little alarming, and welcome to Dr. Palmer and Jean-Luc, Dr. Jean-Luc Payan and Tim Van Woorden. They're going to take us through this. Jean-Luc, I think, is leading us through it. And then we'll have a 10-minute presentation from Derek Todd, the Principal Coastal and Hazard Scientist for Jacobs, New Zealand. He's there. Good, thank you. Welcome to you. Technical lead for this investigation. And Derek's a coastal geomorphologist. New term for me, but I'm there now. With more than 35 years experience in managing coastal resources, monitoring and investigating coastal processes and hazards, and assessing the potential future changes in coastline and river mouth stability. Please note that Derek's not going to take questions or advise us on our future actions, but he'll take technical questions. Is that all right? It's looking at me. Okay, so we're in your hands, Jean-Luc. Thank you.
I'm just going to give an introduction to the work. I'm going to give a 2-minute introduction to the work that we've completed, and after that, Derek will explain the details of the technical investigation, and we'll be after that happy to answer questions. Just to give a little bit of context for that work, in the past we've been doing investigation around coastal erosion in the Clutha Delta area. And that was mainly based on observation, historical photos, vegetation lines, surveys. All of that was indicating coastal erosion in that part of the coast. The purpose of the work that we've completed recently with the support of Jacobs was to confirm those observations in a comprehensive way, but also look to predictions of coastal erosion, take into account climate change. You probably remember about a year ago, we did a site visit with most of you on the Clutha Delta, and we were standing basically near the core mouth of the river, looking one side you had the sea and the training line, and behind you had the Clutha River, which is basically the outlet of the Clutha catchment, which cover a very large part of Otago, including the major lakes. So all that water is basically going to pass that point and interact with the sea. So today we're going to talk really focus on the coastal processes and how this affects the coastline and infrastructures. But we need to keep in mind that that's one aspect of the issue there, and there are other processes that are happening that we're also considering to help decision making and decision around land use and infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a fascinating piece of work. Just incredible to look at and to see where it's going. And it tells us a lot about what to expect over the next 50 years. Over to you. Thank you and welcome, Derek. We're not hearing you at the moment.
Sorry, there we go. Good afternoon.
There we are. There you are. Thank you. We've got you now. Lovely.
Good. I'll just check, is someone running the slides from your end, or am I to share my screen?
If you can share your screen, please.
Okay. Bear with me.
Right, he's about to be there.
I've lost you somewhere.
So are you just relax and take a minute? We'll talk among ourselves while you find them there.
Yep.
Trying to do 2 or 3 things at once is too hard.
Yeah, share screen. There we go. That be that one.
So this one, Jean-Luc, was really something that'll help us inform, won't it? This will help us inform our decision making over the next few while.
Yeah.
Okay, we got you there and we got your slides. Thanks, Derek. Far away.
Okay, I just have to go and find the slides myself now because I can't see them and do it at the same time. No. How do I just
Good old technical challenge.
Yeah, this is. I'm used to Teams, not. How do I? I'm trying to see it on the screen so that I can actually change them for you at the right times. So my apologies for this, but for some reason I can't seem to find it.
Okay.
What are you still seeing?
We're seeing Clutha Delta and Molyneux Bay coastal morphology investigation. Looks like your intro slide.
Yes, that's good, but I can't get to the slideshow myself to change them.
Oh, so you can't change the slides?
I can't,
Okay.
no, because I can't, as much as I can share that with, oh, if I go back to,
Just remember how you do it.
I go to there.
He needs his grandson.
I unfortunately, I can't seem to be able to change the slides.
Okay.
Email them to here.
Do you want to email them through to us? If you want to do that?
Well, you should have them. I would
We've
have
got them in
emailed through.
PDF form, but not as slides, Derek. Okay, we'll open them up and put them up on our as a PDF, and you can just tell us when to move on to a slide. Okay.
Okay, that's fine. So you can move to the second one now if you like.
Okay, just right.
And
We're just
look, just while they're doing that, the second one is just an agenda. I'm just going to put a wee bit of context around the shoreline and the erosion at Molyneux Bay, then talk to you about the results of the erosion assessment and then the results of the coastal inundation assessment. So I really need to go to slide 3.
We're getting there. That's all right. Just about there. Liz is on it.
There we go.
Okay, so we're going. That's
So
the
yeah,
agenda
if we
slide.
go to the next, we can go to the next one if you like.
Yeah. The background slide. There we are.
So yes, so just a bit of background. So this investigation is that 11 kilometres of southern Molyneux Bay, from Kaka Point to north of the Martau mouth of the Clutha. The key parts of it, as you're well aware, is that the two branches of the Clutha down to the two mouths at the Koau and Martau. And those two channels were formed about 500 years ago going across that plain. Then on the right-hand side of the slide gives you a context of, if you go back to that one, yes, the right-hand side gives you a context of the sediment transport and flows into the Molyneux Bay. So we have sediment transport coming around Nugget Point, around 55,000 cubic metres a year. We have material coming down the Clutha, and that has changed considerably over time. Pre-Roxburgh Dam in the 50s, that's estimated at around 500 or just over 500,000 cubic metres a year. And that was an increase from pre-land clearance and gold mining. But then post-Roxburgh, that estimate has dropped it right down to around 42,000. So something like a 95% decrease in the sand and gravel that comes out and into the coast. And that's important for coastal erosion, obviously. And then the other important part of this piece of coast is this big hatched sand wedge, which occurs in the lee of Nugget Point. And that contains something around 7,200 million cubic metres of sand. So a lot of the sand that's come past Nugget Point and come out of the Clutha over the last 10,000 years is in that wedge. And the landward part of that wedge is able to be reworked by waves and things back onshore, but anything that goes into the outer part of the wedge is too deep of water to get moved back onshore. And again, that's important in terms of the processes. So we can, having that background, we can now go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Put it into an historical or European historical context. This base map is around 1847. And you can see that there was only one mouth to the Clutha down at Port Molyneux. And the original work on coastal erosion for this piece of the coast was done by a chap called Jeremy Gibb in the 1970s. And he mapped that erosion from around that time through to 1962, which is the green line you can see in the shoreline. And it showed that that coastline was accreting through southern Molyneux Bay, quite different than what we see now. And that's because the Clutha put all its sediment to the south at Kaka Point. So all of that piece of coast was nourished naturally by Clutha material. Just to put that into the context, we have the 1946 shoreline in black, so close to 62, but then we have that 2020 shoreline a long way eroded in the southern part of the bay. And what happened in 1878, you had the largest flood ever in the Clutha, and it then cut the Martua mouth to the north, and which meant that there was a change in the sediment supply, the location of where that supply came into the mouth. So this overall total picture is quite different from what we see now. So what we needed to do was unpick those time frames and look at what those effects are in different time periods around control of the mouth and what was happening, to actually look at what might happen in the future. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. So if we look at the Koau mouth in its historical context, we can see in the middle picture a set of dates from aerial photography of where we've got the mouth, and it's moved around quite a lot. We see in the left-hand little picture the 1946 mouth seems to discharge pretty much in a central position, and we can see from the middle picture that stayed in that position through to 1962. Then it migrated north to around 1972, and that resulted in the northern work, the northern training wall being done. It came back to the south back to the centre, but then migrated a long way south through to 1982. And that included the picture of that 1978 flood, which was the second biggest one ever on the Clutha. And so it was discharging sediment to the south and nourishing that beach to the south. As a result of trying to stop that southern flows in the south, training wall was constructed in 1983. And since that time, the mouth has been pretty much confined by those training walls into the middle position. So we again have changed where the sediment is coming into this coast. And that then affects also what it does in terms of renourishing the coast around it. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. At the northern mouth, at the Martau mouth, again, it went to the south historically. And we can see that in that 1982 image, it was to the south. What that meant, it could get closed up a lot more frequently. And we had backwater effects called flooding, which resulted in that the mouth works there being done in the 1980s and 1987. And we can see it in the 1997 image, that sometimes that's got outflanked and the mouth has continued to come south. And we can see a former channel there of 1992, 93. And that meant that the mouth has had to be opened and that training wall has had to be extended at various times. So there's been a lot of change around the mouths naturally and then artificially, which have an impact on how our coastline is performing. Because as I said, it affects of how the sediment is arriving at the coast and how it is then can be distributed along the parts of this coast. So the next slide, thank you. So if we then look at the historical shoreline change since our period of aerial photography, which is from 1946, and if we can look at the southern part of Molyneux Bay, we can see the change from our 1946 position, which is our browny sort of position. We can see some accretion out to 1962, which is our green line, and then various parts of erosion going back to our 2020 position. And so over that whole period, there has been high erosion rates, but there has been fluctuations as well. And those fluctuations coincide very well with when the Koau mouth has been able to discharge to the south, and therefore we've had accretion of that south line, of that shoreline, and when it's been located to the north and all the sediment transporting to the north, and we've had quite rapid erosion. What we can see in the period from looking at these lines, and I admit it's difficult from looking at them, but in the post-war South Training Wall period, being from 1997 through to 2020, the whole cell has consistently eroded, and its average rates are very alarming. At the south end, around 9 to 10 metres a year, through the centre at around 6 metres a year, and at the northern end, adjacent to the wall, at around 7.5 metres a year. So that's, if we looked on a national sort of scale, they're very large rates of erosion that have been occurring over the last 20 odd years. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what this slide is an attempt to look at those time slices, and two slices of the blue dots being individual measurements of shoreline erosion or shoreline change before the Koau training wall, so that's the period from 1946 to 1982, compared to after the training wall, so that 1997 to 2020. And as you can see, those rates of erosion have really accelerated. So from somewhere around 2 metres a year down closer to Kaka Point, we're up to 4 metres a year closer to the mouth. We've now seen in that last 20 years erosion rates of around, as we said, around 10 and 8 metres a year. So something has quite clearly changed in this part of the coastline in that last 20 odd years. Next slide, please. Going a little further north through the Inchclutha shoreline, we can see there is not the same degree of movement, but we can still see that there is fluctuations in movement. And again, we had advance in the 1946 to 62. Then we had erosion from 62 to 72. Then we had advance again. And again, these changes are quite well related to where the mouth is. In that 1972 period, you can see the mouth was very well north. The other key trend we can see along Inchclutha is that the amount of erosion rate or the trend of erosion rate has reduced as we go north towards the Matua, and that the distances, the erosion distances and the change in shoreline are much less there. And in fact, when we go north of the Matua, our shoreline has actually been accreting. And so the sediment that has been inputted from the Clutha, from both mouths, as it transports north, is supplying this coast. And it's being able to grow that coast in terms of the shoreline in front of the cliff seaward. So it has not been having the same trends and having the same issues around erosion as those to the south of the two mouths. Next slide, please. So we can see those two areas, the Inchclutha being the first of the circled bubbles, and the erosion rates, even though they've fluctuated within time between the mouth, the works at the Koau have been relatively similar. And again, when we look north of the Matua, we can see that accretion occurring through both that earlier period and the later period. So that those, regardless of smaller time period fluctuations on those 40-odd year, 20 to 40 year scales, we don't see the works, the mouth control works, having an influence to anywhere near the same degree. And in fact, north of the Matua to no degree at all, compared to south, the very southern part of Molyneux Bay. Next slide, please. So in trying to project this into the future, there's two components of that future projection. The first is the extrapolation of what's happened in the past, because that's a function of sediment supply and sediment transport. And the second is what will sea level rise do to it. So what we've done in that extrapolation of the historical trends into the future for the southern part of Molyneux Bay, we've actually broken it into two different scenarios. And that's because of the potential influence of the wall. So that and the wall being the training works, the southern training works. So what we've also looked at is the time slices of retreat. So we've looked at a time slice of 30 years, so through to where the shoreline might look in 2050. And then we've looked at where it might look in 2070 and 50 years. And so for that first period, we've assumed that the training wall stays there. And therefore the extrapolated erosion rates are those circled by the brown dots, that they are maintenance of very high rates of erosion. For the 50-year scenario, we've looked at two sub-scenarios, one with the wall still being maintained, and so still the continuation of very high rates. And then we've looked at the second one, which is if the wall was removed, what influence might that have on what our shoreline to the south would look like, or where it would be positioned. For the rest of the Molyneux Bay, as you can see, so north of the Koau mouth, we've just used the same rate of erosion extrapolation because there isn't really a difference. Now, the bit that I missed out, sorry, is to explain why we might have this acceleration of rates in this last 20 years in the southern cell. So there's really four potential contributors to that. One is that there's a lagged response to the reduced supply since the construction of the Roxburgh Dam. So that influence of the the trapping of the Roxburgh Dam on sediment supply to the coast occurs quite some time after the construction of the dam, and possibly up to 50 years. So that's one possible reason. The second is that there's been a lack of significant floods in the Clutha in that 20 years from November 1999 through to December 2019. So in the 20 years covered by that time, we really didn't have any floods putting large impulses of sediment into the coast. The third is that presence of the southern training wall prevents that southern migration of the river mouth, and the reasons for that were around flooding in the river. But what it has done as a consequence is removed any significant periodic sediment inputs into those southern beaches. And the last one is that the alignment of the training wall directs the ebb tide jet slightly further offshore than what it was in the past, and into a more northerly sediment transport pathway, so that we have reduced the supply to the southern section from the Kauai mouth down to Kaka Point. So we've taken those extrapolations, we've added the effects of sea level rise on erosion, and we've arrived at some projections of what the shoreline might look like. And that's the next slide, please. So these are our projections with both that historical trend extrapolated and with the effects of sea level rise. And we've done that with the sea level rise scenarios, which are suggested by MFE, that could occur over those 30 and 50 year timeframes. So the first scenario is the 2050, so the 30-year scenario with a 0.2 sea level rise. And as we can see in the southern end, and this is with the wall, with the training works maintained, we might have around 300 to 320 metres of erosion. And that's really the yellow position that you can see there. Our current shoreline is the black line. The yellow line is our projected similar vegetation position on an average position in 2050 with a 0.2 sea level rise. Then what we've also mapped in the dotted lines is, under the probability work that we did, is what's a possible worst case. And so that's a probability is that there's only 5% chance that it will be exceeded. And that's the yellow dotted line. You can see that 300 metres, if we had that worst case, could be up to 400 to 450 metres of retreat, with the wall retained over the next 30 years. If we then push through to 50 years and with the wall still in place, what we look like is the orange and brown projections. So 500 odd metres at the southern end, reducing down to around 400 closest to the wall. It could be a little more, up to 25 metres more if sea level rise was up to 0.6. And it could be up to 240 odd metres more at the worst case. The other scenario was if the wall was taken out in 2050, what would that do? And that pushes us back to the two blue lines. And you can see the erosion distance, because we would then allow sediment input back to the southern part of the coast, and therefore those projection or extrapolation of the historical rates reduces because we've got supply. Sea level rise effects remain the same, and we come back to possibly around 350 to 370 metres under our average, and reducing round to 330, and in fact increasing up to 400 closest to the wall. Now, all of this erosion along this coast is due to a rollover effect. It's a low barrier with a low wetland lagoon environment behind it. And what happens is progressively over time, waves roll over that barrier, it gets lowered in height, which means more waves can continue to roll over, and it becomes a cyclic sort of erosion. And that's driven by lack of sediment supply. As we said, we go back to those four reasons as to why that sediment supply is not arriving along this part of the coast. And obviously, you can see by those shoreline positions, that would have a large effect even in 30 years on the Lower Clutha flood protection and drainage scheme in this part of the coast along the channels that would infill and in fact along the flood banks as well. And that in 50 years, it would definitely be having very large effects on that, and also would outflank that southern mouth training wall. So the next slide, please. For the Inchclutha coast, we see the movements not quite being as large. So the projections are the same, the yellow being 2050 and the brown and the orange being 2070 with various combinations of wall. And you can see the wall effect is not so great. We have an offset in the erosion to what we had on the south to what we had on the north. It doesn't get back into the Inchclutha diversion, but there is an area of very high dunes through here that provide protection against inundation that under these erosion scenarios would be impacted and would reduce that natural protection for inundation along those areas. And again, we see that reduction in the projected rate as we go north, but again, all of those projections mean that the works at the Matua mouth would come under threat and issue within that 30 years and definitely within that 50 years. North of there, north of the Matua, we carry on that accretion because the extrapolation of historical influences is greater than the effect of sea level rise. And so there is no erosional issue projected for that northern part of the coast. Next slide, please. So the coastal inundation assessment was what we call a bathtub assessment. So what it did was take extreme sea levels, which included storm surge, and they were information we received from NIWA, and we looked at what would be the difference between a 100 and a 200-year return period event of coastal sea level with storm surge, with some waves set up, and where would those water levels intersect with various things on land. And so those, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, those static water levels are around about in the 100-year ARI 2.2 metres to 2.3 metres in the Dunedin vertical datum, or a 200-year event only slightly higher, only 4 centimetres higher. And then we started adding sea level rise, that 0.2 sea level rise, 0.4 sea level rise, 0.6 sea level rise, to see where it intercepts with the flood banks and the land behind. On the map in the middle, we have the base ground levels. And so again, you can see along the Parua diversion, very low land, either side of the flood banks, up through the middle, very low in Inchclutha, but we have that band of high coastal dunes along the front being greater than 3 metres, and then it increases as we go up the Matua mouth. Now on the right-hand side, there's a couple of plots of what those, so we have the top one being the Port Molyneux flood bank against some of those water levels. And we can see the black line in there is the current 100-year static water level. And we can see there's some parts of that bank that would be potentially overtopped in that type of event. But then if we add, the purple line is if we add 0.2 sea level rise, and we can see that we're getting around 50% of that bank could potentially get inundated. And if we add a 0.4 sea level rise, we can see that around 95% of that flood bank could be inundated. And those sea level rise, remembering, are around 30 to 50 years' time. So even without the erosion, there is the potential of inundation issues on the flood banks as well. The lower right-hand plot is the same on the Parua River diversion on the flood banks. Again, there we can see that the current 100-year and 200-year ARIs are not going to cause a lot of inundation. But as we start adding sea level rise and 0.2 increments, we get increasing lengths of bank potentially over top. But I point out this is a quite simplistic model. It's a model that is used as a first cut to determine where more complex modelling may be required. But it gives an indication of potential issues and potential risks of where things may have those issues in as we go forward with sea level rise in the future. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very interesting presentation. Do we have questions, anybody? Any questions for Derek? Brian.
How you going there, Toddy?
Good, thank you, Brian.
Good stuff. This is my home patch, actually. And I was also thinking that the great southern chief Teowaki was born and lived in this area as well. There's a lot of history. So you're saying technically that if we do something with the training wall, we may minimize the amount of erosion over the next period of time, yeah? Either by its alignment or its presence.
Yes, so I think the driver first, though, will be that the wall becomes under increasing attack, and therefore you, as an asset holder, will want to do something around that. And in making those decisions, then you can add into those decisions, okay, is there design elements that therefore can reduce the erosion?
And am I able to ask a subsequent question?
Yes, please go right ahead.
I'm not sure if it's in your field, Toddy, but what are the chances of like a tsunami coming through there and doing something unusual? You know, like it's quite a flat plain and it seems to go a long way. What are the chances of a catastrophic event?
Well, our chances of catastrophic tsunami, while it wasn't covered in this study, is something that I had looked at, though not particularly in this area. But they are really the biggest probabilities or biggest risk to us is South American coastal earthquake. And yes, if we got the size of events that GNS have indicated as possible at, say, a 500-year return period, then yes, inundation would be very extreme, and it would be up around, potentially around the inundation areas that we might see with sea level rise of more than 1 metre.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No?
Yep.
Oh, Brian, okay, go right ahead.
Okay, so we've got the technical scenario, but at what point do we balance this up and say, oh, look, don't worry about it, you know, from a financial perspective or a cultural perspective? So that might be an ORC question. Like, at what point do we start throwing dollar values at it, values of land lost, you know, like it's dairy farming land or wetlands or the road? Or when do we start balancing those other factors up for a path forward?
Through you, Madam Chair. So yes, we have, well, the first thing I'll say is that this is just one of a number of pieces of work that will inform an overall adaptation response for the Delta as a whole. The other piece of work underway is the Lower Clutha flood scheme review. So that's underway at the moment. And the third piece of work is the recently installed groundwater bores, because obviously with rising sea level, there's potential for rising groundwater level and therefore impacts on land drainage, which is an issue for us as the owner of the drainage scheme. So the answer to your question is yes, there's a piece of work to be done, complex piece of work to be done with the community and other stakeholders on what is the appropriate response to all of these issues.
Yeah.
Hilary and then Kate, and then Kevin.
Just something I didn't totally understand. I see on page 22 of something or another, that this report says it's copyrighted. Does that mean we can't put it out anywhere, or if we're the client who commissioned it, what's the story about it?
Is that to me as Jacobs?
Yes.
Yeah, so the copyright covers your use. You as the client, it is a report for you, and therefore the copyright applies to anyone else other than you.
But what we would often do as a council is put it on our website, for example. Who knows what somebody might not do with it on our website, and we would be actually allowing them to, because we are a public organisation. So
Most of our report, a lot of our reports for council on these hazards things do end up in that forum, and I'm not aware of any issue around the copyright with that.
So does it really mean it doesn't have copyright for us to disseminate and put on our website the way we usually would?
I'm not aware, as I say, I'm not aware of an issue. I've done these types of reports for many councils. And, certainly haven't struck it as an issue. And certainly as I understand, our view is that it's up for what you want to do with it is up to you. And then if you put it on your website, it's if someone takes that information and uses it in a way that you're not happy with, then that's your responsibility.
Okay, so I'm just going to take it from what you're saying that you're not claiming copyright against any usual use that we would make of it.
Correct.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Wilson, thank you. Then Councillor Malcolm, then Councillor Noon.
On that point, I had another one which has gone out of my head while Councillor Calvert asked that. So in your recommendation is that we endorse the report and presentation and dissemination of this information to the public and stakeholders. Should we be officially passing this on to Clutha District Council, who have to deal with any information they have officially?
Sorry, Madam Chair, yes, we've done that already.
And do we know if the effect of that was to note anything on their LIM reports, or do we know if they take any action thereafter?
Well, I can check, but they've only received it in the last week or so. So, it depends on whether they've issued any limbs in the last week.
Yeah, no.
They obviously generate them on demand. So, but we will talk with them about how they intend handling it from a property information point of view.
Thank you. And I'll come back if I recall in time what my other question was, sorry.
Councillor Malcolm.
I'm just trying to get a bit of an understanding. So if I took away the Roxburgh Dam, and there's another one up there too, the Clyde Dam. So if I took them away, this coastal erosion probably wouldn't be happening, or it would be happening at a far different rate, wouldn't it? Because you would have, we're missing a fair bit of stuff being dumped there, aren't we?
That is the potential, but what you've got to recognise is those time lags. So any positive response from that could well be lagged over 50 years as well. And by which case the effect of the sea level rise that we've talked about in this report would be occurring.
So that the biggest part of this issue has actually been man-made anyway, hasn't it? Like this is while it's a natural process of the sea and the likes, we've actually created that.
I think Dr. Palmer's shaking his... Oh, so you're right with that? Did you want to respond?
I think just be a bit careful about apportioning about issues of liability and exacerbation. I think if it's a technical question, I think just need to be a bit careful if we want to get into any more detail. We'll have to go public excluded.
Fine. So the building of the dams have created less sediment falling in the areas that used to fall in.
It's one of the complications.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
it's a contributing factor at this point, I think.
Yes, but we can't appreciate as to how much of that erosion is due to the Roxburgh Dam. It's not something we've attempted to do. It's not something I believe is possible to do.
Okay, Councillor Noon.
Funny enough, I had a similar question, and obviously you said that there was about 10% of the sediment coming down the Clutha now as compared with over the years pre-dam situation or dam situation, and also the lack of flooding. And I just wonder with the Roxburgh Dam, the ability to desilt through their dam. I understand they can release at a low level within the dam. What impact would that have, if any?
We haven't looked at that in this report, and that's something that is something that Meridian or Contact, whoever is the owner of that scheme, I think it's Contact, would be far better placed to answer than I could.
Councillor Laws.
We were just listening to you. Great presentation. Thank you, by the way. Great slides. And Kevin and I were looking at each other going, why would you take out the wall now? Why would you wait until 2050?
That's an option you may consider. It was just in terms of our scenarios.
Thank you, Derek. We decided we weren't going to actually ask you about any future options for that because there are liability issues. So we're not going to talk about that in a public meeting.
Aren't we?
No.
Oh,
You missed that.
Technical only questions.
okay,
please,
well,
of-
if you took
of
it out
code.
now, then I'll ask it another way. If you took it out
course you
now,
will.
would that mean that you could replenish that southern beach
Southern end.
quicker and more effective? No.
I don't
That's
believe you've
very
gone that far. I don't believe that that's where this report.
We
has
haven't looked
got
at that
us.
scenario. No, we didn't model that scenario.
Okay.
Who would I ask that question?
Any
of
further
you?
questions here? We might, Gavin, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just a couple of answers to that question. Obviously, the 2050 that Jacobs used was just a scenario to test. It wasn't any kind of, we're not saying we would do anything in 2050 or wait until 2050. Those are decisions yet to be made. Whereas taking out the training line might make some things better. It would obviously make some things worse too, because its fundamental purpose is to maintain a free mouth in a fixed position from a flood flow point of view. So whilst it might, make the sediment shoreline retreat issue better or less worse, because in all scenarios is retreat, you'd create another problem. So you've got to really think through how you manage the dynamics of flood flow, river mouth position, shoreline position together.
And the land that would be retreated, is that privately owned farmland?
Well, we're not using the word retreat.
if you watch this
in the longer term land that is potentially eroded under the scenarios we've modelled, yes, there's some private ownership and some public land.
Chair, if we have questions that are of a technical nature and want to understand this to a greater degree, what is the medium that I can ask those in? And
You would need
as
to go
a-
into public excluded, is my
I
understanding.
don't want to do it now, but I'm just saying,
Is that correct?
Yeah, it's fine to ask the technical questions. I just
Yeah.
feel we shouldn't be getting into questions around starting to apportion
Any
effects, liabilities
or
to
any-
anybody on this information. If we want to do that, we'll need to go public excluded, and it might require
further reporting, because
Further
even any
reporting.
future action has, apart from a communications plan, that's the only future action that's in here, apart from making this this public and getting the information out. There's no other action. If you want more action, then we need to bring another paper and it needs to come into public excluded.
You mean no other action recommended in this paper?
Well, our recommendations are to receive the report, note the changes, note the information and endorse the report and dissemination of it. Councillor Noon.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Given, I just had a question with regards to the Clutha or Lower Clutha Delta drainage scheme, flood and drainage scheme. Are there any, and obviously the report suggests about further investigation, ongoing investigation, monitoring, etc. Is there any obvious symptoms now that are clear with regards to the future service level that the Otago Regional Council can provide with that particular flood and drainage scheme? So is it under threat in any way, shape or form under its current service levels? Does that make sense?
I might get Ms. Mifflin to answer the question, but I'll give it a start. I think with sea level rise alone, setting aside any questions around shoreline position and going back through our flood scheme, there are questions there about impact on land drainage in the longer term. And that's why we've recently established a groundwater monitoring network, which will inform some more analysis around what those scenarios would look like in the future. But we certainly have concerns.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. Noting the comments just about next steps, in the report it talks about the scenarios, but it also talks about future monitoring or monitoring recommendations. I don't think that's part of the, I suppose the question is, are you going to come back to us with a response to the monitoring, or have I missed something in the recommendations? So I've just lost that version. Skipping between meeting agendas, sorry.
We do, the report does provide for building understanding, planning for further investigation and preparation for adaptation.
So the planning for further investigation, I mean, there are recommendations in there. Normally we would accept the recommendations and act on them or come back to a paper with what actions are. So the monitoring recommendations, are we accepting those, or, and that was to use a drone, I think, and to do some further, because it's, I think to be fair to Mr. Todd, it's the limited, he's had limited information to build the scenarios, so he wants them tested. I think that's a recommendation. So is that what your further investigations will be?
Through Madam Chair, look, I think we have received the recommendations from Mr. Todd. We obviously need to work through which ones we would accept and how we would go about implementing. They have a cost, and the monitoring for this issue has to be considered along with the monitoring of groundwater, flood and all of that. So we have a comprehensive monitoring program for the Delta. We already do have monitoring obligations in respect of contact entities' consents. We do a 10-year survey of beach transects and also the offshore sand wedge. So we're not asking you today to accept all of the recommendations in the Jacobs paper, because they have to be obviously have to be priced. We consider this part of a wider program, and we'll come back to you in due course.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Councillor Robertson. Could you put your microphone on, please?
Move the recommendations, if that's okay, and just sort of note that there's 6 properties that are affected, and we have already, I think, spoken to those landowners and given them a heads up that this is coming. It affects private land loss of 6 properties. It's probably not a, oh, I don't know whether it's a immediate hazard. It's probably more of a creeping one most of the time, unless you get a big flood, which is always on the cards in that area. And yeah, I guess as Dr. Palmer said, it's part of a bigger picture for this area in terms of hazard risk that all needs to be weighed up. So just, it's really, really useful to have this information for the coastal part of the issue. But yeah, if we're assessing this, it's going to need to be with all of the information that we've got as a bigger picture for this area. But yeah, at the moment, it's properties losing land.
It is, and this is only one piece of several parts, several pieces of information that are coming through on this. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Hope, thank you. Is there any further discussion? Right, okay, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Thank you very much, Derek Todd, for an illuminating report, if alarming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on now to transport. Okay, let me just find where I'm up to and my stuff. Okay. I know, I'm going to go. as fast as I can.
We'll just take this as read, Madam Chair. Happy to take questions.
That would be great. I'd just like to, as we receive this report, I would just like us, and welcome to Julian and Gary. As we receive this, I'd like us to thank this department for their efforts and their contractors and drivers, because this department of OIC have received a better public rating than any other thank you team. Anyway, over to you now with this report, which may not be quite as fabulous, but it's not too bad. In your hands.
I'll just take it as read, Madam Chair.
Take it as read.
Happy
Any
to
questions?
take
So we've
questions.
got Councillor Calvert.
I was just having a wee look at the northern unit, or whatever it's called, which doesn't suggest that there's more patronage. As far as I can tell, I might not be reading it quite correctly than there was before. It may not have dropped as much as one of the others or something. No, what I'm thinking about is that we're looking at the possibility of what we do with Palmerston, the Palmerston service. And I'd start by saying, if people want more service, are they using the one they've got? And if they're not using the one they've got, do we know any more about why they wouldn't be using it before we provide them more, especially if the government's
I don't
not
think we're getting into
predisposed to.
that. We're just trying to accept this report.
Isn't that in the council report?
Is this,
I'm
is
saying
it
yes.
part of this?
no, and I'm saying today, because that's in our head for tomorrow,
Mhm.
I'm saying today, am I reading this incorrectly, or is there nothing in here that suggests that that service is being fully utilised at the moment, or even utilised more than it was 2 years ago, or any, I mean,
If I can, Madam Chair.
could you just talk to that
Palmerston
unit one?
service is
Yeah.
one part of Unit 1.
Yes,
And you may not recall, when I brought back a report to you earlier in the year on the $2 thing, I had some graphs in there showing how the longer routes had responded, which includes the Palmerston one,
Yes.
and its patronage was certainly up compared to most of the Dunedin routes. It's only 3 buses a day compared to most services which are half hourly or hourly. So they've got a lot more buses. So it's challenging to compare, the small amount of patronage on that service because of just the frequency
yeah,
of
I
service
can,
that it
I can,
has.
yeah, I can, well, just if we could have something that would tease out that for tomorrow, perhaps that would be useful, because as I say, I'm only talking to this paper today because I thought I might find it in here, and maybe I wasn't looking as well as I might. Thank you.
Councillor Scott?
Yeah, what should I take from this report? I mean, basically, because it seems to me the first paragraph talks about our patronage is lower. And then this paragraph 3 talks about where fare revenue was significantly higher during the $2 fare trial. And then the 4th paragraph talks about where there were exceptional levels of patronage for a time. So I've read the report. What should I take from this report?
I think, and it's there was some feedback previously, and it was suggested by somebody that we actually put some additional visualization of the impact of COVID, which is basically figures 4 and 9 in the report.
Okay,
and that basically, I can take you just a minute to go through. If you flick to figure 4, which shows Dunedin weekly patronage. So this is the first time we've included it in the report. Now, if you look at the orange line, that's Dunedin 2019 patronage. So that's your typical solid year patronage. The light blue line, you can see it starts in, that's 2020. The following year starts off actually better patronage, and then there's a massive dip as alert level 4 hits, and then it creeps up and up. until we get to alert level 1, we have a period of free travel. Go cards introduced in September, and then levels off again. And again, this year to date, you have, as in for the full calendar year, again, the purple lines start off tracking previous trends, and as soon as we get to August, September, and that delta and the alert levels come back in, there's a big drop. And this is the issue with COVID and alert levels and so on. Trying to do year-to-date financial years and comparisons gets very muddled because of the various alert levels. So that visual representation, I think, helps give a better idea of where we're at. As far as revenue goes, just bear in mind that at least for Dunedin, that on top of the lower patronage that affects both Dunedin and Queenstown, in Dunedin we're still continuing the $2 fare trial, and in the example of, say, Palmerston that Councillor Calvert raised, that can be a difference of $20 odd on the return fare compared to what it currently is. So the fare revenue is impacted by COVID alert levels and also the ongoing $2 trial.
Through you, Madam Chair. My question was, what should we take from it? So your blue line, thank you for this graph. It's amazing. Should we take it, if you exclude COVID, that we would anticipate patronage in Dunedin to be higher? Do we take that, is that a reasonable sort of maybe conclusion? Is there a conclusion there regarding the free travel? Is that if we did a trial, is that, or all these little assumptions I'm making wrong?
If I can, Madam Chair. So I think the takeaways are patronage. COVID's impacted us this year and last year. If you look at, take that out of it, patronages for Dunedin is about where it was before COVID. Now, there are some contributing factors. Free, you will always get more, but free doesn't necessarily get you a whole lot of outcomes that you might be after. So you've got an impact of free in there. And then the second thing around fares is, while the $2 has helped our patronage, because around the country, patronage is not tracking particularly well in many other of the centres. While that $2 fare has helped our patronage, it's also come at quite a cost.
And Madam Chair, my final question, like buses and COVID, it doesn't really work, like when we get COVID here in Dunedin, it's not really going to work, is it, from a patronage perspective, in terms of spacing and requirements, or am I wrong?
So at the moment, we're under the orange traffic light. And what that means is basically services can keep going the way they are. So there's no spacing. They can have standees.
But people might be reluctant.
And that's one of the things we've seen out of COVID is, of course, there's been a change in travel patterns because the whole flexible work thing's come up. So you've got more people now that are working from home, for example, that used to come into the city. Yes, I think, when COVID hits here, there may be an impact on the bus service, but it'll be, it won't be that huge dip, I don't think, that we saw last year, because you've got 90% of the population double vaxxed. We've got masks. There will be spacing on buses. They are provided there for essential services.
I wanted to try and wrap this up as quickly as we can. We're quite a long way behind, but I've got Michael Laws, Gary Callaghan.
Very quick question. We understand you've been impacted over the last 2 financial years, both this and the previous one. Against the planned budget or deficit that was put into, what are we tracking to lose against our budget in Queenstown and Dunedin for the financial year? And what do we do? Actually, Nick's probably the person to ask. And then what do we do, or where do we find that additional revenue?
So through you, Madam Chair. So for Queenstown, the revenue assumption for this year and was about, our patronage would be back to 70%. So we're about 10% lower than that. So that has to be reflected next year. in the LTP, we assumed next year would be 70. Well, it's unlikely to be that. It's more likely to be back to that 60%. Dunedin, you have the issue still around the $2 fare. And so the budget assumed a fare take pre-COVID in terms of the money that you're getting because you had zones. You still have to deal with that, what you do as a result of the $2 fare.
Okay, so roughly, Nick, what are we down?
I don't know that off the top of my head. When we did the Q1 report, we said we'd bring back the Q2 with a forecast where we could factor that. Obviously, Q1 was heavily impacted by the Delta alert levels and the fare revenue that you see the dip there. So we have to factor in that that's gone for this year. But then we have to look at, as Gary said, there's other things that are non-COVID that are still impacting this year versus budget. So that's the $2 fares here, and Queenstown patronage is tracking lower. So then we'll look at that when we do the Q2 report. We'll do a forecast and estimate where we think it's going to be. But there's other things I don't know where the discussion's at with Gary and his team with NZTA, whether they're coming to the party with any additional subsidy at all, like they did with the first COVID loss of revenue. I don't believe they are, or those discussions are still ongoing. So we need to just work through that. But then the simple answer is, once we know what our fare revenue, or we can estimate where it is, we compare that to budget. Essentially, the difference comes out of either Waka Kotahi or out of our transport reserves. So if Waka Kotahi don't come to the party, or they go, they might then subsidise half of that. We then factor that in. Whatever we're short just adds to the deficit in the transport reserve. And then we have to look at that as we go through our annual plans and through into the LTP about, do we want to increase targeted rates even more than what we're forecasting to increase them to claw that deficit back as we'd planned, or which would mean because we've already got the deficit increasing and we've got targeted rates increasing year on year, we might have to adjust our thinking on targeted rates, or we just have the deficit remaining longer than what we'd originally forecast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kelleher.
Happy to move recommendations.
Thank you much.
Seconded.
All in favour?
Aye.
Anyone against? Thank you, and thank you for your attendance and focused attention. And we'll hand over now to Councillor